So long before the internet and the relative popularity of extreme metal, finding such bands back then was a bit of a challenge. Basically, you had to take a whole lot of chances. So in this video, I'm going to go through 10 ways in which I used to find great metal albums and how some of these methods actually work in the modern day. So definitely stick around. This is going to be a good time. So as some folks might remember, buying metal back in the 1980s sometimes presented some challenges, especially if it was extreme metal, and especially in North America. I think Europe had a much better time of being exposed to certain bands. Our mainstream media was definitely not embracing of this music at all. I mean, Circus Magazine wasn't exactly doing cover stories on Venom. You weren't hearing Celtic Frost on commercial radio, and MTV was definitely not playing live Exodus concerts. So we had to find this music ourselves, and admittedly some of that was kind of fun, finding those bands. It was tough, but it was fun. Of course, this is where my checklist comes in, the 10 ways I used to find all these great metal albums. And of course, this is without an internet. There really wasn't much of an internet back in, say, 1984. There was certainly no World Wide Web. There was a bunch of terminal emulation, and there were some gated services like CompuServe and Delphi and Prodigy. I'm not going to get too nerdy on you, but there weren't a lot of metal fans on those services back then, so it wasn't a resource that was usable by any stretch. The cool thing about this list, of course, is that a lot of it carries over to now. You can find an analog to modern times and the ways other people use things. Sometimes you can find digital solutions. So this list is going to be a little bit nostalgia, but it's also going to be utility too. So there you go. So let's take a trip back to the 1980s and see how us old dudes found great metal. So one of the first ways in which I sought out a lot of great metal bands back in the 80s, especially extreme metal bands, or simply independent metal bands, as we were probably referring to them for the most part, was through record labels. And a lot of people didn't use the record label method. I don't know why. You'd find a good band on a label and you think to yourself, maybe there are other great metal bands on this label. More often than not, there really were. It was really great. Also, compilations from these labels helped out a lot too. Metal Massacre series obviously is one of those. But I want to talk about 4 labels in particular that were really big for me, finding all of this extreme metal. The first of which, of course, is Combat. And this is the original green labels. Later they went to camos. Obviously, Exciter, Long Live the Loud. This is a great album. They also had Exodus and Possessed on Combat. Pretty cool. And of course, Venom was brought to the States through Combat. They did a distro deal with that. So, very cool label. Combat Records. Can't go wrong. Of course, we also have to talk about Roadrunner. Roadrunner is a great label. Brought us Merciful Fate. Merciful Fate's first record here, Melissa. Great label, Roadrunner. Roadrunner also was big on bringing European bands to America. That was one of the big things about that label. So if you were getting exposed to bands from Europe in America, you might have had it happen through Roadrunner. So there you go. Of course, also we have to talk about Megaforce Records, Johnny Z, obviously Overkill's first album, amazing album. Of course, Anthrax is the other success story with Megaforce, but great label. Megaforce also did some distribution for some of the European bands. I want to say Raven was helped out through Megaforce, but other bands too. So definitely cool label. And of course, as I mentioned before, this is Metal Blade. Gotta have the Metal Blade. I love those original labels. So cool. Brian Slagle, of course, in Los Angeles, bring us, at first, LA bands. LA bands that clearly weren't Motley Crue and Dokken. They were more extreme. Slayer came off of Metal Blade originally. So there are a lot of other great bands. Armored Saint as well. So very cool label. Metal Blade, still around, by the way. But definitely back then, that was a label to check. Of course, nowadays, the modern equivalent to these labels would be Nuclear Blast, also Metal Blade, as I mentioned. There's also Season of Mist, and Relapse, and Peaceville, and Napalm. So many great labels out there now. And, you should check out those labels. If you like some bands on them, maybe you'll like some others. So, there you go. Check your labels. Another way in which I would pick records to buy back then was through the cover artwork, but I want to specifically talk about an artist that a lot of folks know, especially in the realm of death metal, especially starting in the 1980s. Of course, I'm talking about Ed Repka. If you saw an Ed Repka cover, they're so iconic and so, you know them when you see them, kind of a thing, that you want to buy the album immediately. And that was probably one of the reasons I bought this album. This is clearly a classic, a death metal classic. This is Death with Scream Bloody Gore, their first album. Clearly Ed Repka, the minute you see it. Fantastic work. He also did work for Venom. This is the Here Lies Venom box set. He did the cover, but he also did some interior art here of the three of them dead and decaying. Love it. He also did the cover for Sanctuary's first album, Refuge Denied. Again, you can see the style similarities here. You know what to look for when you look for him. He did Evil Dead, too. I don't have that on vinyl, but that was another great cover. Their first album, Annihilation of Civilization. And Dark Angel. A lot of people look at this cover and they don't see Ed Repka right away because this is a photograph. So where's the artwork? The artwork is right here. He did the logo for Dark Angel on this cover. So there's that. Of course, to be honest, any album cover that looked vaguely evil or satanic or shocking was going to be appealing to me, but to a lot of other metal fans in the 1980s. I mean, the PMRC was already telling us that's what we wanted. And, they were right. So that's what we did. This definitely leads me, of course, to the next point on my checklist. So yes, definitely the very next criterion for picking great metal albums back then were evil-sounding song titles. I mean, even album titles in general, but the song title specifically, if you're flipping the record over and you're checking out the track listing, you're thinking to yourself, these are evil-sounding songs. So you're looking for that, the twisted titles, the horror-related titles. Of course, this is the way I discovered bands like Venom and Bathory and Possessed, but also Slayer. Gotta say it, this is Hell Awaits. This is their second album. You should have it already. Great song titles, of course. You've got At Dawn They Sleep, and Necrophiliac, and Crypts of Eternity, Hardening of the Arteries, Kill Again. Who else did I miss? Praise of Death, of course. So you're looking at those titles, you're thinking, yeah, I need this album. Of course I do. And maybe the cover art helped too. The next method of discovery of these albums was definitely through friends. If a friend had the album and it was awesome, then you could buy it yourself. That worked out a lot, especially in high school with me. My buddy Eric and I've talked about Eric a number of times. He's on the Record Store Report at least once, if not twice. You can go check those episodes out. But he and I were definitely turning each other on to different bands. He definitely introduced me to Metallica in 1984. He had bought Ride the Lightning when it was new. Likewise, The Legacy from Testament back in 87. I, in turn, got him into Merciful Fate in 1985 and Destruction in 1986. He and I talked about this. We were having a nice back and forth last week about it and all the bands that we discovered through each other. So with friends, it's kind of a big thing. One thing that was funny that I was thinking about was that we'd go to the record store, and I'm sure a lot of people did this and maybe still do it, I don't know, is one friend would look through the records and the other one would see an album cover that looked good or whatever, maybe the evil sounding song titles are there, and be like, hey, you should get that album. And you're saying that so they do buy it, so that they listen to it, and if it sucks, you don't have to buy it, and if it's good, then you buy it. A little sneaky, but it also worked, and we all did it. No one's exempt from that. So obviously this method works in modern day as well. Maybe it works a little bit more with digital music. Maybe you're pointing people to playlists or Spotify, YouTube, those kinds of things. But back in the 1980s, this method was kind of crucial. I mean, you'd have friends that buy albums, you'd buy albums, and you either lend them to each other or play them for each other, and that's how you got exposed to bands. It was a pretty cool method. So the lesson here, listen to your friends sometimes. So another method of discovering bands back in the 1980s was definitely through the liner notes of certain albums. You buy an album, you read the liner notes, they're thanking other bands, and you're thinking to yourself, maybe those are good bands. In fact, if you kept seeing it over and over again in numerous liner notes, you're like, a pattern is forming. Maybe I really should check out that band. Anyways, we're going to talk about Possessed. This is Seven Churches, this is their debut album. Classic album, of course. Liner notes right here, they thank bands. They thank Slayer, they thank Exodus, they thank Sacrilege and Dark Angel and Death Angel. And you're like, if I see those names pop up enough, guess whose albums I'm buying? Obviously. So a good little method. A lot of people never use the liner notes method. I don't know why, because it's a gold mine. Just check them out. So this next method of discovery is a little bit more band-oriented than album-oriented, and it's band t-shirts worn by other bands in concert. You go see a band, you see they're wearing t-shirts, and you're like, hey, those look like cool bands. I like that band. Maybe I'll like the band they're liking. Sometimes that works out. One of the earliest examples of this for me was reading Circus and Hit Parader and those other magazines, and Iron Maiden would show up, and Steve Harris would be wearing some cool shirts. a lot of times it was Fastway. I keep seeing pictures of him in a Fastway t-shirt. And I'm like, hey, that sounds like a cool band. I love Iron Maiden. So that's actually how I discovered Fastway. It wasn't even the Trick or Treat soundtrack, which would come a couple years later. So it worked for those bands, the more mainstream bands as well, but it really was kind of crucial for these more independent bands because they were showing you bands you probably weren't seeing so much. So definitely t-shirts. You would definitely see pictures of these bands on the backs of their records, also in the requisite band collages that were inside a lot of these records in the inner sleeves or on the inserts. Also in zines. Zines, of course, are small pressed published magazines, fan-made kind of magazines. We might talk about one of those a little bit later, but that was definitely the way you discover things. And in relation to the backs of album covers, we're going to talk about this album. This is Cyclone, Brutal Destruction. Great album. But, of course, if you flip it over and you see the band, they're wearing shirts. In fact, they're wearing the exact same shirt. They're both wearing Exodus t-shirts, specifically the Slay Team design. That was a popular Exodus shirt back in the mid-'80s. So I'm sure Belgian kids were like looking at this album going, who's Exodus, right? You can barely make it out, but there it is. So that was a really cool way of discovering bands, is through bands wearing other bands' t-shirts. Of course, it's not just bands doing this. Fans do it too. In fact, here's one right here. You're welcome, Dave. Of course, another method to use were metal magazines that knew what they were talking about. I'm going to qualify that quite a bit because mainstream rock and metal mags were not covering this stuff, especially the really heavy stuff. And if they did, they didn't know what they were talking about half the time. So back in the 80s, I definitely had a subscription to Kerrang. Kerrang obviously is a UK mag. It always took like a month to get to the States, but it was always worth it for me every month. There are other magazines too. Metal Hammer and Metal Forces were good ones, also from Europe. But another great source were zines. And of course, I just mentioned zines. They're handmade, fan-made magazines. Obviously, a lot of cut and paste, a lot of Xeroxing happened, typewriter text, all that kind of stuff. I did want to mention this one. This is Sounds of Death. This is the very first issue of Sounds of Death. This later became a pretty big death metal magazine in the 1990s. It got a little glossier. It became a legitimate magazine. But this is issue number 1, which is actually a bit of a collectible. You can go on eBay and go find out for yourself. But great little zine. And this is how you discover bands. Here's Napalm Death, and Unleashed is in here. And some of the labels, too. You could check out some of the labels. There's Metal Blade and Immolation. Just really cool. I love the top 100 death metal albums of all time list because it's definitely including all sorts of thrash bands and grindcore bands, and all of that happened. That was the thing back then. A lot of things got lumped into certain genres. They didn't split off as much, at least in the public consciousness and the independent media at that time. This is 1992, I believe. Yeah. Also, Malevolent Creation. So cool stuff. Zines. They were definitely a good way to find out about bands. But also, again, those metal magazines, the good ones. So there you go. Of course, the European magazines used to also cover American bands, which is pretty interesting. And I don't know if it's irony, but, if you wanted to read about Metallica in 1984, you were reading Kerrang! Magazine, of all things. You weren't reading Hit Parader. So I always found it interesting and kind of odd, but you had to go to where you had to go to read about these cool bands. So a lot of the European mags were it for me. Of course, let me know in the comments which print sources you check out for albums, even if they're online. You kids still read, right? Of course you do. So another way I discovered cool bands back in the 80s, and this definitely works now, there's no time limit on this whatsoever, are new bands formed from people leaving other awesome bands. Of course, the classic example here is Dave Mustaine leaving Metallica, or Metallica leaving Dave is more probably the point, and forming Megadeth. So pretty cool example there. There are others. King Diamond leaves Merciful Fate and forms King Diamond. Ozzy leaves Sabbath and forms Ozzy. Dio leaves Sabbath as well and forms Dio. Coverdale leaves Deep Purple and forms Whitesnake. Likewise, Ritchie Blackmore leaves Deep Purple and forms Rainbow. So a lot of cool examples. I'm sure you can give me more in the comments. I'm sure there are a lot more of examples out there. A lot of solo bands kind of come out of this. But, some bands aren't always that great. But a lot of them are, especially if they're musicians in cool bands. So sometimes that's a nice gauge of where to go for new bands. Of course, sometimes this doesn't work out. I remember when Larry Lalonde left Possessed. He did Blind Illusion for an album, but then he went on to Primus, and I'm not a Primus fan. So it depends. I mean, some musicians leave other bands because they want to do radically different music. So that doesn't always work out. But I always feel like as long as they sort of stay in genre, I tend to be happier. So that's just me. You might feel differently. Let me know in the comments either way. Another method I want to talk about, of course, is college radio. You know, before the days of streaming and YouTube, if you wanted music to come to you, it was usually the radio. And mainstream radio wasn't playing these bands. Again, I've said it before, but college kids and community members who had radio shows on college radio stations were playing a lot of this music. They were playing extreme metal. They were also playing a lot of punk rock and hardcore. So if you were in those genres, that might be a way you discovered bands too. I had a radio show back. I had one in the early 90s, especially. I did some radio in the late 80s as well with other people. It was a great way to get bands I liked out to other folks. So college radio was a really big deal, especially back in the 80s and the early 90s for discovering extreme bands, independent bands, and the like. So these days, I would imagine that streaming radio services and stations and the like are still around, not killed off yet by YouTube and Spotify and the like. If you listen to those, you should definitely let me know in the comments which ones you do listen to, how much you enjoy them, and how important they are to your overall listening and discovery of bands. Who knows? And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about opening acts. You go to shows, you see the headliner, you're there for the headliner, but then there are these opening acts, and sometimes they're really amazing. I discovered a lot of bands back in the 80s and the early 90s this way. Overkill was one of them, of course. Sanctuary, Rothschild America, Corner, so many bands. I would put Annihilator on that list, but we were actually stuck in the line outside while they played their set, and when their set ended, we got in the door. So technically, I never saw Annihilator, but I did hear them live. I don't know if that counts. Anyways, speaking of Sanctuary, here's my ticket from 1988 at the Providence Memorial Auditorium. Amazing show. Megadeth weren't that great, but Sanctuary were just on point. And of course, the very next day, I went out and bought Refuge Denied. Had to do it. So a lot of these bands prompted me to do that. Literally the next day sometimes. Just run to the record store and get their album because you're so impressed with their performance live. And you wouldn't have discovered them unless they were touring with bigger bands. So that's a perfect way to discover a lot of these bands. Cool way, actually. Admittedly, sometimes I don't remember a lot about some of these shows. I had quite a few beverages in the 1980s. Some of you might have as well, but of the ones I remember, they were fantastic. And those are the 10 ways I'd pick metal albums to buy back in the 1980s. Of course, if you had any interesting ways that you bought them, or still do to this day, let me know in the comments. Maybe you have some great stories of album discovery when you were a teenager, if you're as old as I am, and if not, maybe you just have some cool ways you find records. In fact, let's just make the thread about discovery. The magical world of discovery. Do it in the comments. It'll be fun. Of course, if you were even mildly entertained by my nostalgic ramblings that also apply to the modern day, admittedly, definitely give me a like. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Share the video with some friends. This is the Accusation Network. I do metal vinyl collecting videos each and every week. Always Mondays, sometimes Thursdays. So check out the playlists, check out the videos. I do lots of cool videos on vinyl hauls and upcoming metal vinyl and classic album reviews. Sometimes I go to record stores. Maybe I'll go to more of them because COVID's lifting and I can do more of those episodes. Cool stuff. Check out the playlist. You'll like it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.